I've always loved swimming in the pond. It's tucked away at the edge of the woods, hidden from the rest of the world. The water is calm and cool, surrounded by trees that feel like they're guarding some ancient secret. It's peaceful. At least, it used to be. That evening, the air was heavy with the promise of rain, but the water was colder than usual. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I floated on my back, I noticed something odd. The surface rippled, even though there wasn't any wind. When I climbed out, I looked back at the pond and froze. The waterline had dropped. Not a lot, but enough to notice. It was like the pond was draining. And then I saw them. Faint shapes shifting at the bottom. They weren't fish. They were too big, too deliberate. I swear they were watching me. I stood there on the muddy shore, staring at the water, trying to convince myself I hadn't really seen what I thought I did. Maybe it was debris, fallen branches or rocks disturbed by the shifting water. That made sense, didn't it? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that those shapes were something more. Something alive. The air felt colder now, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. I should have turned around and left, but instead, I crouched at the water's edge, peering into the dark depths. The surface rippled again, as if disturbed by an unseen current. The shadows at the bottom shifted too, moving in ways that didn't look random. I grabbed a small rock and tossed it into the water. It splashed and sank, but the shapes didn't scatter the way fish would. Instead, one of them stopped moving. It froze completely, hovering in place like it was aware of me, watching me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back. My foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell hard onto the ground. The sharp smell of damp earth filled my nose as I scrambled to my feet, suddenly desperate to put distance between myself and the pond. The trees felt closer now, their branches stretching overhead like clawed hands. I turned and hurried back toward the trail, my heart pounding. As I walked home, the sensation of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent shivers racing down my spine. By the time I reached my house, my nerves were raw, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. That night, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. The memory of those shifting shadows played on repeat in my mind. What were they? How could they move like that? I told myself not to go back. Whatever was at the bottom of that pond, it wasn't for me to find out. But the next morning, I couldn't help myself. I went back to the pond as soon as the sun started to set. Something about the twilight felt right, like it would reveal what I hadn't been able to see before. The water was even lower now, exposing more of the muddy edges. The pond looked wrong, less like the tranquil place I'd known, and more like a shallow wound in the earth. I carried a flashlight this time, gripping it tightly as I stepped closer to the edge. The beam cut through the surface, lighting up patches of silt and reeds. The shapes were still there, darker now, more distinct. My heart raced as I leaned closer. The symbols were the first thing I noticed. Strange, twisting patterns etched into the mud near the bottom. They were too precise to be natural, their curves and lines almost hypnotic. The shadows moved again, faster this time, swirling around the center of the pond. They weren't random at all. They were following a pattern, tracing the same shapes etched into the mud. I stepped into the shallow water, my boots sinking slightly into the muck. The flashlight's beam flickered as I moved closer. The shadows reacted instantly, converging toward the middle of the pond like they were being summoned. That's when I saw it, a hole in the center of the pond, perfectly round and impossibly dark. It didn't look like an ordinary hole. The edges were smooth, almost polished, and the water seemed to flow into it, disappearing into the void. A faint whisper reached my ears, too quiet to make out but unmistakably there. I froze, holding my breath. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped, and then, from the depths of the hole, something moved. It was pale and fluid, twisting as it rose toward the surface. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it, a hand, impossibly long and thin, stretching out of the water. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and splashing into the water. The beam wavered, illuminating the hand as it clawed at the edge of the hole, followed by a second hand. My chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing in my mind. The thing pulled itself higher, revealing a face, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that locked onto me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But even as I sprinted toward the trees, I could still feel those eyes on me, pulling at me like they wanted me to stop, to come back. When I finally reached the safety of the trail, the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. But I knew I couldn't leave it alone. The pond wasn't just a place anymore. It was something else entirely, and it wasn't going to let me go. I stood at the edge of the trail, my breath ragged and my body trembling. The whispers had faded, but the sensation of being watched hadn't. Every instinct screamed at me to go home, lock the doors, and never return. But the pull was still there. The pond wouldn't let me leave it alone. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the basin. My flashlight was still there, its faint beam cutting through the dark water. The pale hands had disappeared, but the mud around the hole seemed to ripple, like something beneath it was alive. My legs felt heavy as I stepped closer. The mud sucked at my boots, and the air grew colder with each step. I reached the flashlight, snatching it up and gripping it tightly. The beam flickered, but it held steady enough to illuminate the hole again. It was wider now. The edges were smooth, almost unnaturally so, and the void beyond it felt deeper, darker. The runes etched into the mud around the hole glowed faintly, their shapes shifting as though they were alive. The whispers started again, louder this time. They didn't feel distant anymore. They were inside my head. Come closer. No, I whispered, shaking my head. My voice felt small against the sound. The mud shifted again, and the shadows rose. They weren't random shapes anymore. They had form now, tall and humanoid, their limbs unnaturally long and their faces blank. They stepped closer, their movements jerky and disjointed, like puppets on invisible strings. One of them reached for me. Its hand passed through the beam of the flashlight, and for a split second, I saw its texture, like smoke and liquid, twisting together. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the flashlight at it. The light passed through harmlessly, but the shadow recoiled slightly, as if hesitant. The hole trembled, and the pale hands re-emerged, clawing at the edges. The creature rose again, its gaunt face more distinct now. It wasn't human. Its features were stretched and wrong, its mouth too wide and filled with jagged, uneven teeth. "You woke us," the whispers said, merging into a single voice. "I didn't mean to," I shouted, stumbling backward. My boots slipped in the mud, and I fell hard, the cold seeping through my clothes. The shadows closed in, their blank faces tilting toward me. The creature lunged forward, its bony hand gripping my leg. The cold was unbearable, like frost spreading through my veins. I kicked at it, but its grip didn't loosen. The runes glowed brighter now, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. Desperate, I clawed at the mud, my hand brushing against one of the symbols. It felt warm, almost alive. I pressed my palm against it, and the effect was immediate. The creature shrieked, its grip releasing me as it recoiled. The shadows flickered, their forms distorting and wavering. The light from the symbols grew brighter, pushing them back toward the hole. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding as I stumbled toward the edge of the basin. The whispers turned into a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. "You can't run forever," the voice said, echoing in my mind as I climbed out of the mud. I reached the top of the basin and collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. My body ached, and my hands were scraped raw, but I didn't care. I was out. The whispers faded again, leaving only the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I turned back toward the pond, half expecting the creature to crawl out after me, but it was still. The runes had dimmed, their light fading into the mud. The hole remained, dark and yawning, but the water was rising again, slowly filling the basin. It was as if the pond was trying to cover its secrets, to bury them once more. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling as I backed away. The pull was still there, faint but persistent, tugging at the edges of my mind. When I reached the trail, I glanced back one last time. The pond looked almost normal again, its surface calm and reflective. But I couldn't forget what lay beneath it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face, its hollow eyes and jagged smile. The whispers echoed in my mind, growing louder until I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. By morning, I convinced myself it was over. The pond was filling back up. Whatever I'd seen was trapped again. But as I walked into the kitchen, I froze. There were muddy footprints on the floor leading from the front door to my bed. My chest tightened as I followed the trail, my breath hitching when I reached the window. The glass was fogged, and in the condensation, a single rune was drawn, the same one I'd touched in the mud. My phone buzzed on the counter, making me jump. When I picked it up, there was a single message on the screen. "We're not done yet." I dropped the phone, my eyes darting to the window. The pond was visible in the distance, its surface shimmering in the morning light. For a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath it, a shadow, faint but deliberate. And then it was gone. The pull was stronger now, and I knew I'd be back. Have you ever felt drawn to a place that didn't feel quite right? Share this story with someone who loves mysterious and haunting tales. Driving through my hometown was supposed to be a quick detour, just a trip down memory lane. But as I turned onto Main Street, I realized something was off. The town felt too quiet, too still. When I reached the old church, my hands tightened on the wheel. The cemetery was packed with people, all dressed in black. I slowed the car, frowning. Funerals weren't unusual, but something about this felt wrong. And then I saw it. A banner hanging over the cemetery gates. "In loving memory of Clara Matthews." My stomach dropped. That was my name. I parked the car without thinking, my heart hammering as I stepped closer. The faces in the crowd were familiar. My parents, my high school friends, even old neighbors, all mourning as if I was dead. I stopped in my tracks when I saw the casket. My name was engraved on the plaque. My legs felt like jelly as I moved closer to the cemetery gates, my breath shallow and uneven. The whispers of the crowd carried over the crisp air, low and somber, but no one seemed to notice me standing there. The banner with my name fluttered slightly in the breeze, mocking me with its impossible declaration. I stepped closer to the gathering, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, my voice trembling as I spotted them near the front of the crowd, standing shoulder to shoulder. My mom's face was pale and tear-streaked, and my dad looked like he hadn't slept in days. They didn't react. I shouted louder this time. "Mom, it's me. I'm right here." But nothing changed. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and my father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. They looked right past me, as though I didn't exist. I stumbled closer to the casket, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. The polished wood gleamed in the sunlight, and the plaque on the lid sent another jolt of terror through me. Clara Matthews gone too soon. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the edge of the casket for support. It was real, solid. I couldn't breathe. The priest cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was steady, authoritative. "Today we gather to celebrate the life of Clara Matthews." My head spun as he recounted details of my life, details only I would know. My childhood, my graduation, even the time I broke my arm in middle school. The crowd nodded solemnly at every word, their grief tangible. This wasn't a mistake. They were burying me. "No, no, no," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "I'm not dead." The whispers grew louder around me, but no one acknowledged my cries. My hands trembled as I backed away, bumping into mourners who didn't even flinch. It was as if I wasn't there at all. I turned and ran, my shoes crunching against the gravel path as I fled to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, my vision blurring with tears. The engine roared to life and I sped away from the church, desperate to escape. The streets of town blurred past me as I drove, my chest heaving with each panicked breath. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation. Was this a prank? A hallucination? I gripped the wheel tighter and turned onto the main road that led out of town. But as I drove past the familiar landmarks, the diner, the library, the hardware store, an icy dread settled in my chest. The road didn't lead out of town. I found myself back at the church. "No," I whispered, slamming the brakes. The car skidded to a stop and I stared at the cemetery in disbelief. The banner was still there, the crowd still gathered around my casket. It was like I'd never left. I threw the car into reverse and took another road. This time I aimed for the old highway that curved around the outskirts of town. My heart soared briefly as I passed the last gas station, the familiar signs of the town fading into the distance. But the moment I turned the corner, I was back on Main Street. The church loomed ahead, the banner hanging like a grim proclamation. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I screamed in frustration. What the hell is happening? I parked again, this time on the far end of the street. My legs wobbled as I got out, but I forced myself to walk, determined to figure out what was going on. The town felt even quieter now, unnaturally so. The air was thick, and my footsteps echoed louder than they should have. I spotted my parents walking down the sidewalk, their heads bowed in conversation. Relief washed over me. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, running toward them. They didn't look up. I reached out, my hand brushing against my mom's shoulder. She stopped abruptly, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she shivered, pulling her coat tighter around herself. My dad muttered something I couldn't make out, and they continued walking as if I weren't there. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They couldn't see me. I staggered backward, the world spinning around me. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, like the town itself was speaking to me. "You shouldn't have come back," the voices said, distorted and overlapping. I ran again, aimlessly this time, turning down every street and alley I could find. But no matter where I went, the same landmarks greeted me. The diner, the library, the church. It was like the town wouldn't let me leave. The streets twisted around me like a maze, each turn bringing me back to the same places. The diner, the library, the church. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't escape the loop. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me in disjointed fragments. My name echoed in the distortion, layered with strange words I couldn't understand. "Stop it!" I screamed, clutching my head. "What do you want from me?" The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth. My eyes darted to the church and I realized something had changed. The cemetery was empty now. The crowd was gone, the casket missing. The whispers urged me toward the graveyard, their overlapping voices forming a single haunting phrase. "Go back. It's waiting." I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the cemetery gates. The world around me seemed to dim as I stepped inside. The headstones were sharper now, their edges stark against the darkening sky. At the center of the cemetery was a single grave, freshly dug. My name was carved into the headstone, along with today's date. I stumbled forward, my breath catching in my throat. The grave was open, the earth freshly turned. The hole yawned wide, impossibly deep. The whispers were deafening now, a symphony of voices chanting my name. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the grave. It was me, or something that looked like me. Its face was hollow, its eyes sunken and black. its mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach its empty gaze. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice overlapping with my own. "But you can't leave now." I stepped back, shaking my head. "Number, this isn't real." The figure tilted its head, mimicking my movements. "You came back. You opened the door. Now you're part of it." The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the grave seemed to grow wider. Shadows rose from the pit, twisting and writhing like smoke. They reached for me, cold tendrils wrapping around my legs and pulling me closer. "No!" I screamed, kicking and clawing at the ground. My hands found a loose stone, and I hurled it at the figure. It didn't flinch. The shadows tightened their grip, dragging me closer to the edge. The whispers turned into laughter, cold and mocking. Desperation surged through me. I clawed at the ground, my fingers scraping against the dirt. "I'm not supposed to be here," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You are now," it said. The figure's words struck me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The shadows pulled harder, dragging me closer to the edge of the grave. My nails tore into the dirt as I struggled, but the earth crumbled beneath my fingers, refusing to give me a grip. "You don't have to fight," the figure said, tilting its head further. Its voice was almost soothing, but there was something beneath it, a malice that seeped into the air around me. "It's easier if you don't." The shadows wrapped around my legs like icy chains, tugging me forward inch by inch. My body trembled, my strength fading. I knew I couldn't hold on much longer. My gaze darted toward the headstone. The inscription glimmered faintly, the letters shifting as though they were alive. I focused on it, desperate to find a way out. "You don't belong here," I whispered, my own words sounding foreign in the thick, suffocating air. The figure froze. Its hollow eyes narrowed slightly, its smile faltering. For the first time, it seemed unsure. "You don't belong here," I shouted again, the words tearing from my throat. I grabbed a jagged rock from the dirt and smashed it against the headstone. The sound rang out like a gunshot, reverberating through the cemetery. The ground shuddered violently, and the shadows recoiled, their tendrils loosening their grip. The figure hissed, its twisted face contorting as cracks began to form along its skin. "You don't understand," it said, its voice trembling with anger. "You can't undo this." The earth beneath me shifted, and I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the ache in my legs. The grave was closing now, the edges collapsing inward as if the ground was swallowing it whole. The figure staggered toward me, its movements jerky and frantic. "This isn't over," it screamed, its voice splitting into a distorted chorus. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I turned and ran, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted for the gates. The shadows surged after me, but they were slower now, disjointed, their forms flickering like dying flames. I burst through the cemetery gates, collapsing onto the pavement outside. The whispers stopped. The cold receded. When I looked back, the cemetery was gone. In its place was an empty field, stretching endlessly beneath the dark sky. No headstones, no grave, just silence. I stumbled back to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door. The engine sputtered to life, and I drove aimlessly, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had just happened. The town was silent as I passed through it. No lights, no movement, just the darkened outlines of familiar buildings. When I reached the edge of town, my heart lifted briefly. I was free. But as the road stretched out before me, I felt the air grow heavy again. I rounded a curve, and my stomach dropped. The church loomed ahead, the cemetery gates standing open as if waiting for me. "No," I whispered, slamming on the brakes. I grabbed my phone, frantically scrolling through the contacts. I called my mother first. The line buzzed, and then her voice came through, flat and distant. "We're not available right now. Please leave a message." "Mom, it's me," I shouted. "Please answer." but the line went dead. I tried calling my best friend, but the same thing happened. Every call led to silence or static, as though I was shouting into a void. My phone buzzed and I froze. A single notification appeared on the screen. You can't leave. The shadows from the cemetery flickered in the rearview mirror, twisting and writhing as they edged closer to the car. The house across the street was nothing more than a ruin. Charred beams and scorched walls stood like tombstones, marking the place where a family's life had ended. The neighbors didn't talk about it, and I didn't ask, until I started hearing the laughter. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind. Late at night, just as the world was falling asleep, I'd hear faint giggles floating across the street. Then came the sound of running feet, soft thuds on non-existent floors. Curiosity got the better of me. One night, I stepped outside to listen. The laughter grew louder, and I could hear whispers now, indistinct but insistent. I squinted into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, small and quick, darted across the ruins. My blood turned cold as I realized it wasn't alone. There were more shadows, too many to count, moving through the house as though it had never burned down. I froze on the porch, gripping the wooden railing so tightly that the edges bit into my palms. The shadows weren't just flickering. They were moving deliberately, darting through the ruins like children playing tag. It was too deliberate, too lifelike to be the wind or a trick of the light. The giggles echoed again, sharp and clear. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but it wasn't just the laughter. There were other noises now. Footsteps, faint and rapid, like someone was running through the rubble. One shadow stopped abruptly. It lingered near what had once been the doorway, its form wavering like smoke trapped in a strong breeze. My heart pounded as I stared, unable to look away. I could almost see something within the shadow, a pair of faint, glowing eyes staring right at me. I stepped back, my foot creaking on the wooden porch. The shadow didn't move, but the giggling grew louder, more persistent. My chest tightened, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. The sounds didn't follow me, but I swore I could still feel the gaze of those glowing eyes. Even inside, with the blinds drawn, the house didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, felt like it carried the echoes of those children's voices. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't leave things alone. I decided to ask my neighbors about the house. They weren't friendly, but I managed to corner an older woman 2 doors down as she watered her flower beds. She straightened when I approached, her expression guarded. "The burned house?" she said, her tone immediately defensive. "Why are you asking about that place?" I thought I saw something last night," I admitted hesitantly. "Heard some noises too. It sounded like kids." Her face grew pale. She glanced over her shoulder at the ruins, lowering her voice. "I wouldn't go near that place," she said. "It's best to leave it alone." "Why?" I pressed. "What happened there?" She hesitated, her hand tightening on the hose. Finally, she sighed. "The fire happened years ago. It killed the whole family. 2 parents, 2 kids. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them." A shiver ran down my spine. "Did anyone find out what caused the fire?" She shook her head. "No one really knows, but they say you can still hear the children playing sometimes, laughing. If you listen too long, they might notice you. And if they do..." She trailed off, her expression darkening. "Just stay away from that place, trust me." Her words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. That night, when the laughter returned, it felt louder, sharper, like it was reaching directly into my mind. I stood at the window, staring out at the ruins. The moonlight illuminated the skeletal remains of the house, its jagged edges casting long, twisting shadows. The laughter drifted across the street, playful and carefree, but there was something wrong about it, something hollow. Then I heard it. the sound of a ball bouncing, faint and rhythmic. The breath caught in my throat as I watched a red ball roll into view. It bounced lazily across the blackened ground before coming to a stop at the edge of my lawn. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The ball wasn't scorched or dirty like everything else in the ruins. It was bright and pristine, as though it had just been bought from a store. The giggling grew louder and my hands trembled as I clutched the windowsill. Then I saw them. 2 small shadows appeared near the ball, their forms shifting like smoke but unmistakably human. They stood still, facing the house as if waiting for something, or someone. One of the shadows turned. Its gaze locked onto me, though it had no visible eyes. My stomach churned and I stumbled back from the window. The laughter changed then, softening into whispers. They weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside the house. "Stop," I whispered to myself, pressing my hands over my ears. "It's not real. It's not real." But the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they filled the room. They weren't words exactly, but the tone was clear. Beckoning, inviting, pleading. A soft thud jolted me from my thoughts. I turned toward the door, my pulse racing. There it was again. A knock, quiet, almost hesitant. I crept toward the door, every muscle in my body tense. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. Then the ball rolled into view again, bumping gently against the doorframe. This time, the whisper was clear, a child's voice soft and almost pleading. "Come play." I froze, my hand inches from the doorknob. My throat felt dry, my mind racing with fear and doubt. But before I could decide what to do, the ball stopped moving, and the shadows reappeared on the porch. They were waiting. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The child's whisper, so faint yet so deliberate, echoed in my ears. "Come play." The words weren't a request. They were a demand. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows outside the window didn't move, but I felt their gaze on me. The ball at the doorframe rolled slightly as though nudged by an invisible hand. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not real." The whispers swelled, overlapping now, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. They grew louder, filling the house until the air felt heavy, oppressive. The ball hit the door with a soft thud, and the knob rattled as though someone was trying to turn it. I stumbled back further, my heart racing. The floor creaked beneath my feet and the air grew colder. And then the door opened. Not all the way, just enough for me to see the ball sitting in the middle of the threshold. Beyond it, the shadows stood on the porch, their small forms wavering like smoke caught in a draft. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and unnatural, as though it wasn't used to its own body. "You promised," the voice said. I froze, my mind racing. "Promised? What promise?" "I didn't," I stammered, but the words caught in my throat. The shadow stepped fully into the house, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally. The room darkened around it, the walls creaking as though under pressure. It stopped a few feet from me, its head tilting to one side. The others followed, their laughter echoing faintly as they crossed the threshold. They moved closer, their forms flickering like dying flames. Desperation surged through me, and I darted toward the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, but it was useless. The whispers were already in the room. The shadows materialized in the corners, their shapes stretching unnaturally across the walls. One of them reached for the counter, its hand brushing a scorched photograph I had picked up from the ruins earlier that day. I watched in horror as the photograph burned again, curling at the edges before disintegrating into ash. The shadow turned toward me, its featureless face flickering with something that resembled anger. "You took it," the voices said in unison. "Give it back." Took what? My mind raced as I remembered the locket. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cool metal. I pulled it out, holding it in front of me like a shield. The shadows froze, their forms flickering like static. Is this what you want? I asked, my voice trembling. The shadows didn't respond, but the whispers softened, their tone almost pleading now. I held the locket tightly, the metal biting into my palm as I stepped forward. The shadows didn't move, but their forms flickered and wavered, their attention locked on the object in my hand. What is this? I asked, my voice breaking. Why is this so important? The whispers didn't answer, but the largest shadow stepped closer, its movement slower now, less erratic. It stretched a hand toward the locket, stopping just short of touching it. You took it, the voice repeated, softer this time. It's ours. Realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The locket must have belonged to one of the children. It was the reason they had noticed me, the reason they wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't mean to take it, I said quickly, holding it out toward them. I'm sorry, please just take it and leave me alone. The shadow hesitated, its head tilting again. Then slowly, its hand stretched out and closed over the locket. The moment it touched the object, the air in the room changed. The cold lifted, and the oppressive weight pressing against my chest disappeared. The shadows began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. But just as I thought it was over, the largest shadow paused at the door. You shouldn't have come, it said, its voice low and heavy. Now you're part of it. Before I could respond, it stepped out into the night, disappearing into the ruins across the street. The house was silent again, the air still and warm. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my body trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. When I finally stepped outside, the ruins were dark and lifeless once more. The laughter, the whispers, they were gone. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. But as I turned back toward my house, my stomach dropped. The ball was sitting on my porch. It was burned now, its bright red surface charred and blackened. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, their forms flickering and stretching. By morning, I decided to leave. I packed a bag and threw it into my car, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the house as possible. But as I drove through the neighborhood, the air grew heavier. The roads twisted, looping back on themselves until I found myself parked in front of the ruins again. The locket sat on my dashboard. A child's voice echoed faintly in my ears. You're part of it now. And I knew then that I could never leave. What would you do if the past refused to let you go? Share your thoughts or theories about Aaron's chilling encounter in the comments below.